Today we're going to be looking at notes 1.5, the Constitutional Convention. So we're going to be learning about how our founding fathers came together to reconstruct our Constitution. Setting the stage. By May of 1787, the U.S. was on the verge of crisis. The weak central government of the Articles of Confederation were inadequate to the problems of a new nation. So the Articles of Confederation was our first constitution that was developed after the Revolutionary War. But under the Articles, there was no executive branch, so no president. The government did not have the power to tax. And this is as a direct result of the Revolution and the British monarchy overtaxing. But without the tax revenue coming in, it left the government very weak in terms of being able to pay for anything. They had no money coming in. All states had to agree in order to make changes. So even though they saw that there were issues with the articles, it was difficult to make the changes necessary to make the Articles of Confederation work. So delegates from the states gathered at a convention in Philadelphia to try to revise the articles. But it became very clear that it would be kind of almost impossible to revise, so they decided to completely throw it away and start fresh. So this constitutional convention became an entirely new plan for the government. The Constitutional Convention. Representatives from 12 of the 13 states attended, so Rhode Island was fearful that the convention would strip states of its rights, so they did not attend. The convention was 4 months long. Each state had one vote. Decisions were made by simple majority, so 50%, more than 50% needed to make a deciding factor. The meetings were held in secrecy, so only the delegates could attend. 55 total delegates attended, and they became known as the framers of the Constitution. Some of the key members of the Constitutional Convention were George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. And James Madison really took the lead and became known as the father of the Constitution. Setting up a government. So the Virginia Plan was presented by the Virginia delegate Edmund Randolph. And this plan would have a central government that was divided into 3 branches: a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. Each branch could check the other branches. It called for a strong central government, a government that could make laws and levy taxes, control commerce between the states, and override state laws. So they saw that was definitely a weakness of the Articles for not having a strong central government. So this is, again, a correction that they're making. It also called for a bicameral legislature, meaning a 2-house Congress, 2 houses of Congress, and that this would be based on a state's population. So the more people a state would have, the more representatives that a state would have. So this would definitely favor larger states. So in the lower house of the lower legislative house would be elected by the people. The upper house would be appointed by the state legislatures. Another plan was known as the New Jersey Plan, which was presented by the New Jersey delegate William Paterson. It also called for a central government divided into 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Each branch could check the other. But this one proposed a unicameral legislature, so only one house of Congress, and each state would have one vote. So it would not matter how many people lived in a state, how large or small a state was. Every state would be considered equal and get one representative, one vote. So bigger states could not overpower smaller states. After 3 days of debate, the convention rejected this plan. The Great Compromise. Roger Sherman of Connecticut created the Connecticut Plan, now known as the Great Compromise. So he proposed a bicameral legislature, so 2 houses of Congress, where the lower house, the House of Representatives, would be based on state population. So depending on how large a state was, would determine how many representatives that state had. Members would be elected by a popular vote, and this pleased states with larger populations. The upper house of Congress would be known as the Senate, and would have 2 members regardless of state size. So in that case, whether it was a small state or a large state, everyone would get 2 senators. And they felt this protected small states with equal representation. Members elected by state legislatures, members within the Senate would be elected by state legislatures. And this was approved July 16th, 1787. And so when the framers of the Constitution are having this discussion, this is kind of one of those instances where we see kind of how outdated our Constitution is. I don't think they realize how big of a discrepancy we would have between state populations. That yes, you would have some bigger states, some smaller states, but for example, let's look at California. In California, we have 39 million people. So we have 53 representatives in Congress. Now compare that to a state like Wyoming. Wyoming only has 581,000 people. There are lots of cities in California that have more than 581,000 people. That is the population of the entire state. So they get 1 representative. 53, 1. California is by far the largest state. But on the flip side, with the Senate, the upper house, California only has 2 senators. Wyoming also only has 2 senators. So in California, our senators represent approximately like 19 million people each. Whereas in Wyoming, these senators are representing I'm doing math off the top of my head, 580 divided by 250, maybe 265,000 people. It is drastically uneven. And so this is kind of an issue that people have kind of with our current representative situation. So the issue of slavery. The issue of slavery played a huge role in developing the Constitution. The issue was not whether slavery would be allowed to continue. So the 2 key points were whether or not slaves should be counted as part of a state's population. So this would greatly increase a state's population. It would grant more power to southern states who tended to have more slaves in these areas. Northern states said that they should not be included because they were not allowed to vote. So this was not part of their voting population. The other issue is whether the importation of enslaved people should be allowed to continue. Should we allow the slave trade to continue to function in our country? And so when we look at issues like this, this was hundreds of years ago. Again, we can see kind of how outdated these debates are. The fact that you're arguing about, should the slave trade continue? Obviously, it shouldn't. But people at that time looked at things differently, and it's really hard to, kind of judge what people were doing back then in terms of, were these people good and bad people? I think it's just important for us to realize that our government now allows for us to change and to update things. So if the issues were not resolved correctly back then, we were able to resolve it when we had the Civil War, and then we were able to pass the 13th Amendment, and that abolished slavery. And so it allowed for us to make these corrections. And also, women at this time could not vote. So women didn't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment. So again, our Constitution allows for changes and corrections to be made as people in our government become more self-aware of these issues, and that, certain things should no longer happen. So the 3/5 compromise. The delegates came to a compromise. Slaves would be counted as 3/5 a person when determining a state's population. For every 5 slaves, 3 would be counted to determine the state's total population for the House of Representatives. Without the 3/5 compromise, Southern states would not have ratified the Constitution. So this was one of those compromises that had to happen, even though people disagreed with it, in order for the Constitution to be agreed to allow for the Southern states to if they weren't allowed to count slaves as part of their population at all, they probably would not have agreed with it. The new Constitution wouldn't have went forward. Presidential elections. Some delegates believed that the president should be elected directly by the people. Others wanted a president chosen by the state or national legislature. compromise on a system where the president would be chosen by the state electors. State electors would match the number of representatives in both houses. And so this established the Electoral College, which is still in use today. It's another thing that people feel is somewhat outdated, maybe should be updated because we don't use a popular vote to elect the president. By summer, the document was ready to be signed, and 39 delegates from the 12 states signed. The Constitution now needed to be approved by the American people. So we're done with these notes. You want to make sure to go back, fill in your key terms. Next week, we will be looking at the Bill of Rights and other amendments to the Constitution.